Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our July edition of the ABA Engineering Academy's engineering webinars. This program is actually put together by a joint effort of the Alabama, the Georgia, and the South Carolina Broadcasters Association. And our co-host today is John George. And John, I'm going to let you jump on here. I see you sitting there and talk a little bit maybe about the upcoming EAS step.
All righty. Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Larry, and of course, Wayne as well. As you know, in just a couple of weeks, we have the upcoming national EAS test that we've had in the past. This will be on August the 11th at approximately 2:20 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:20 p.m. Central Time. And it will be using the PEP system, which is the primary entry point system, and the old daisy chain that is used as a fallback in case of a dire emergency. They will not be testing iPods. It will not be coming down on iPods this particular time. Part of the reason is they want to test the system is there were some issues with some of the PEP stations the last time we did this back in 2019, so they want to be sure that those issues have been corrected. We do urge everybody to go through their boxes, be sure that they have their certificates updated. There is a new certificate update available both from DASDAC and SAGE. You want to be sure that you have the correct version of software. We're still getting calls, Larry and I both, from people that have not updated to the, I'll call it the paid version of software from both of the manufacturing companies or the EAS manufacturers, such as DASDAC, Trilithic, and SAGE as well. And then the other thing you want to be certain of is you're monitoring the proper stations. You need to look at your state EAS plan and determine which stations you should be monitoring. And that's what should be on your receivers, and the audio levels should be set properly so as not to distort, especially in some of the SAGE units, because if you drive the levels too hard, you will create a feedback loop and you will not get the test properly. If you have an issue picking up the required LP1 or 2 in your area, you should contact the State Emergency Communications Chairman immediately. You could contact Larry in Alabama or in South Carolina. I'll be glad to help you, as well as in the state of Georgia. But there are methods of changing the monitoring of those stations for individual radio station or TV station as necessary, but there is a procedure that you have to go through, and it's not something that could be done at the last minute. But I know that all 3 states and most of the states have sent out numerous notifications of the EAS test coming up. There's plenty of good information if you go to the FCC website and to the ETRS portion. There's good basic information there as well. One last thing you don't want to forget, I trust that everybody has filled out Form 1 by now. If you haven't, please do so immediately. Then on the day of the test, after the test has been completed, you will fill out Form 2. You have that day, the 11th, through the 12th to complete Form 2. And basically, it's a quick overview of did you receive the test or did you not receive the test. And then there's Form 3 that has to be filled out. I believe, Larry, it's September the 27th, I believe.
Yeah, the 27th of September.
And that form goes into more detail. Was the audio quality good, bad, or, was it distorted? Where did you get your audio signals from? Did it come from your LP1, your LP2? Did it come from the PEP station directly? So those are some of the things that you're going to be dealing with over the next couple of weeks before the test occurs. And we do urge you that to check all your equipment, be sure that it is operating properly. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with either one of us or the appropriate person in your particular state. And Larry, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to, you mentioned the level of the audio coming into the units, also check the quality. Well, I've seen a lot of stations that they had hum or buzz or crosstalk from another station. So this gives you some time to go in and check the quality of the audio that's coming up from the two monitor sources. Uh, Remember now, those, as John said, those monitor sources doesn't include the National Weather Service or IPAWS. These are the two monitor sources that are assigned to you by the state plan. So make sure that you do that as well. Wanted to also remind you that we have a corporate sponsor that underwrites our all the activities of the Engineering Academy. It's the Max Connect. If you haven't if you're not familiar with what Max Connect is, it's a nice little unit that uses IP, dedicated IP that you can use for remote broadcast or backup STLs or anything that you need to get audio from one place to another. So you can check out that information at www.maxconnect.com and you can get a full information about that unit. Our special guest today is a long-term friend of all of us, Wayne Pecena. He's the director of IT and broadcast at Texas A&M University, and he is also the president of the Society of Broadcast Engineers now. Wayne has been with us in person here in Birmingham when we do our classes and our seminars talking about IT. And one of the big areas now, and the reason we decided that we wanted to have him on the program today, is there's a lot of security problems and holes that might be available or in your IT system there at your radio or television station. And now people that have nothing better to do than sit around and break into systems sometimes will actually block your system and take all your commercials and your music library away and ask you to pay several thousand or millions of dollars to get it back. So Wayne, I'm going to turn the program over to you and let you talk about what we should be doing to protect all of our equipment.
All right. Well, thank you, Larry, and good morning to everyone that has joined us here. As we get started, let me get my screen sharing going here, and we will get started. I guess in one aspect, maybe the broadcast engineer doesn't have enough to do these days. So cybersecurity has come along, and whether we want to or not, it seems to fill that void and certainly added a lot of new task, I guess, to the responsibilities of the broadcast engineer. Maybe as a simplistic way to start, well, what is cybersecurity? And a simple way is just simply focused on the protection of really any of our IT assets. And that could be, of course, computers, servers, hosts, our network infrastructure, our applications, and of course, data that exist in our environment. And of course, as our broadcast facilities now have moved away from what I call that traditional baseband type plant. Earlier, we were joking beforehand a little bit about, well, the good old days of turntables and the teletype machine was your outside information connection and so forth. Those are long, long gone. As we've moved into this IP environment and are dependent upon those IT systems for our broadcast operation, it's even become more critical. When we talk about cybersecurity attacks, they generally will focus on about 4 areas, either just tampering with the system to disrupt that system, maybe trying to obtain some type of sensitive or private information, or disruption of your normal business workflow and practices. And of course, data encryption and extortion, or ransomware, is becoming one of the really prominent threats that we have today. If we look at some of the risks to a broadcast station, certainly they can be fairly varied from, dead air, Again, impacting the availability maybe of resources, a loss of revenue through, again, disruption of that program content, or maybe just simply loss of profit, particularly from a ransomware type event. And again, that list goes on, including even public embarrassment and lost public trust. Well, if you look back in history, um, attacks against a broadcast facility are not necessarily new. They were pretty rare, but they did exist. You might remember Max Headroom of back in the 90s when an STL path of a Chicago TV station was disrupted and the programming replaced. Of course, Captain Midnight, uh, in and around that same time, that again disrupted a satellite transmission. And if you think about these two events, it took some pretty specialized knowledge, it took some specialized equipment, and it took locating that equipment at the right place to do that or disrupt these signal paths. Well, of course, today you can wreak as much or more havoc uh, while you enjoy your favorite beverage with a laptop computer. So what are our cyber threats? And generally we can, I think, put or classify those in two broad categories. One is the malware, and this is of course where we find ransomware. And then we have some type of network attacks, the distributed denial of service or just a simple denial service attack are probably the most prominent in that regard. But again, there can be many different attacks upon a network. A good reference is a publication published by Verizon Business Systems that is just simply a report of investigations of data breaches. And this can be some sometimes casual reading or interesting reading just to keep up and understand what type of events are out in the marketplace. Well, where are threats coming from? Certainly we can have nation states, which is probably one of those that I don't want to say you roll over and play dead and give up, but if that's the level of tax you're dealing with, you're probably doomed. More than likely, there's other areas that come into play. Organized crime is gotten big into cyber attacks simply because it is popular, or it is popular in terms of it's lucrative in terms of generating money. Certainly you have hacktivists, which are out, to save the world, proves a call. If you ever saw the TV series, Mr. Robot, that's probably the best example of a hacktivist cyber security event. And of course, you can have disgruntled employees. You have just plain old hackers that are out for either the challenge, if nothing else. And another sort of not really a threat, you have accidental actions and you have natural disasters that come into play. These are particularly, I only mention these because the precautions that you might take to prevent some of these threats actually lead to help you recover from those accidental actions and national disasters that might occur. If you look at cyber attacks, there's sort of a sequence of events that occurs, and this can be a good kind of roadmap for us. If we look, kind of that first step is this what is often referred to as network reconnaissance or probing of a network infrastructure. What we want to do is find a target host. Maybe that's a single host, maybe that's a group of hosts, but we want to target and we look for ways to which to do that. Well, if we can stop the process at that point, we've saved ourselves a lot of work in many other areas. And we attempt to stop the process at this reconnaissance step by simply minimizing or reducing, or even in some cases eliminating, the visibility of that host device to the external world or someone that might do harm to us. And with that, then that brings us, our first step in security really begins with the network, is to implement strong network security. In terms of the overall environment in IT security, there's really several principles. These are kind of what I consider the 5 principal ones that come into play. And I want to mention these, but at the same time, not get too bogged in by the theory, so we can talk about some more practical ways in which to attack things. But I think it's also important to understand where a lot of our principles or that theory comes from. First is the NIST Practices, which actually is a framework of practices that were developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a series of both preventive steps and evaluations to assess and implement IT security. There's also the concept of defense in depth, which is simply you do not rely on a single method of protection. You have multiple levels of protection. There's also the least privilege adoption, or that mindset of we're going to deny access by default, and you only grant privileges as needed. And that privileges might be granted to a user, a human user, or it also could be granted to an application. And often in our IT systems, the granting of access and privileges to applications is often ignored. In other words, an application might have unlimited access to the infrastructure and so forth. So this is an important one not to overlook. And we also have the concept of a risk-based analysis. This is kind of the concept like your credit score is a way, maybe a good analogy. There are a lot of things we need to do, should do in terms of IT security, but we want to do the things that are most important first and address the others. And some, maybe particularly those with a low risk or something, maybe never get to those. And then finally, we have the concept of the CIA Triad. And with that, let's look at all of these in just a little bit more detail. Again, the NIST Practices is a framework of approaches to maximize protection of an organization, regardless of the size of that organization. Again, developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And the framework is organized in kind of 5 core areas that's illustrated by their logo here, of beginning with identifying assets. This, of course, helps provide that roadmap of what do you need to protect and how do you protect it. It's also important to monitor your IT system activity so that, well, you know when a cybersecurity event has occurred, rather than discovering that 3 months later or something, and there's been, let's say, a major breach of information, credit card information, whatever it may be. Fortunately for the broadcaster, we're usually not in that level of financial transitions, but we do have valuable content, and that often is our program content. And then certainly, if there is some type of breach or event, you have a plan to respond to that and recover. Again, defense in depth is a principle of just multiple layers of protection. You do not rely on any single protection method. You have multiple ones. And of course, redundancy is something that broadcast engineers understand well. And this is just simply redundancy in your protections. And again, That can be many ways in which that is implemented. Probably the best way that I use to illustrate defense of that is the principle of a castle. You have multiple layers of protection, usually beginning with a moat. Well, if someone breaches the moat somehow, they're presented with an outer wall. If somehow that outer wall is breached, there is yet another wall, so forth and so on. So again, these multiple layers. The principle of least privilege is one that simply, again, it seeks to minimize an attack surface. And also, if there should be a breach, it also minimizes how far, let's say, that ransomware event might travel or be redistributed. Again, it is focused on both users, but also upon applications, particularly in a IT environment where you have multiple applications that may interact. Again, a fairly detailed topic, and here's a URL with some little extra reading in that regard. Also, again, risk-based analysis, where we evaluate the different aspects of our IT system and we categorize different events. Again, some of those low impact, low likelihood events, you may never get to that, let's so to say, but we are definitely want to focus on those high impact, high likelihood first. And it's common, again, to use a scoring system in which to, evaluate. And again, I often use the concept of a credit score to make that evaluation. In other words, multiple factors go into that evaluation. You likely have run across or have read about cyber insurance that is available. Certainly a lot of companies take advantage of that. One thing to keep in mind, the cost of that insurance to you is going to be based on some type of cybersecurity risk analysis that insurance company is going to require, or they may not even insure you if you do not meet their criteria. Kind of the logic behind, let's say, when you're insuring, let's say your studio or your transmitter site, commercial insurance companies are going to require certain things in terms of maybe security systems, fire protection systems, and so forth. And then finally, we have the CIA Triad, which also is sometimes known as the AIC Triad, only to not add confusion, because the acronym CIA really has nothing to do with a government agency that utilizes that same acronym. But the CIA Triad is built on three principles. Confidentiality. In other words, we want to prevent information from reaching the wrong hands, or we want to restrict or limit that access to that information. There's integrity. In other words, we want to ensure that data or information that is either stored in our infrastructure, maybe flows through that infrastructure as part of a workflow process, is not changed or altered. Going back to old Max Headroom, that would be an example of, yes, the programming content was changed, so we've disrupted the integrity of that original program content. And then finally, availability. In other words, we want to ensure that our IT resources are available to legitimate users. And of course, this is primarily the target of a denial of service or a distributed denial of service attacks. One realization, or one thing that you must accept in the world of cybersecurity, is your work is never done. It is a continuous, ongoing, revolving process, and of evaluation, implementation, monitoring is extremely important, except, of course, detection, and then the assessment and ongoing policy creation and planning, and again, an ongoing process. So where do we begin into actually from a practical standpoint. Certainly you can spend a lot of money on IT security, both services and measures and so forth. What I hope to present to you today is a more, I'll call it economical approach to that. In some cases, it's capabilities you may have, or it's tasks to do rather than necessary spending a lot of hold card cash, so to speak. So where do we start? Well, we start with the design of the network. Remember, one of our major goals was to minimize the visibility of any of our host device to the outside world. So we want to begin with our design of our network. And then we want to move through a structured plan. In other words, we do not want to necessarily just go off in all directions doing things. We want to have a plan. We want to have a structure. And I'll suggest to you that the OSI model is a great way or a great place to start, and particularly looking at the first 4 layers of the OSI model. If you recall, those are the data flow layers and are associated with the network infrastructure. So how do we implement a plan? Well, let's start with the physical layer, and we want to protect the physical infrastructure primarily from some type of physical tampering. This can be done in many, many ways, depending upon the size of your facility. Now, are you really concerned with someone slipping into the back door of your broadcast station and messing with your network infrastructure? Well, maybe that could happen, but probably that's not what you're protecting against. You're probably protecting against your own employees simply trying to do their job, but they run into a barrier. And that barrier may be on the weekend. Newscaster is trying to get a story on the air and something's not working. And he or she plugs in their own personal laptop into the network infrastructure that may already carry an infection. And they're simply trying to do their job, but they could have devastating impact upon the broadcast infrastructure. So we want to prevent that tampering. And we can do that in several ways, but usually some type of secured or locked environments come into play. As we move up the OSI model to layer 2, we can implement Ethernet switch security and other security capabilities. In other words, if that physical protection was breached, we have another level of protection to prevent some foreign device to be attached to our network. And we can use Ethernet switch security capabilities, such as port security, to prevent that. And then finally, as we move up to the network layer or layer 3, we can implement packet filtering through either an access control list or firewalls. And we also can implement encryption by using IP security or IPsec. And then finally, we can implement transport and application encryption. So from a practical standpoint, what might that look like? Well, let's take a fairly small network, and we want to get away from the traditional network design of a flat design where it's just everything is connected and available. We want to go to a segmented network or a layered network, or sometimes even referred to as an onion network. We established different security zones, and these different security zones represent different functional areas of our business. Well, in our case, in the broadcasting business, that, let's say, the most important thing we have is that broadcast content and transmission that we want to protect. And we will designate that as our most secure zone. But at the same time, we have other functionality that certainly needs some layer of protection, but maybe not the same. Again, often referred to as the onion design, and that comes from the makeup, or you think about a structure of onion. You have the core and you have the various layers, with that internal core being the most secure. Well, if you think about a network, and maybe it's a small network with a few switches or whatever, and you look at this diagram and think, my gosh, that's a lot of network equipment. I would never be able to get the budget to implement all of that. Well, if you look at one of these security zones, which consist of a layer 3 router, an Ethernet switch, and a firewall. Firewall or packet filtering really is what that symbol is implemented. That all can be implemented in a layer 3 switch. And as long as you have adequate ports, that entire infrastructure can be implemented in a single network device with the proper configuration. What have we done? We have isolated each of those networks or those security zones. If one is breached, that doesn't necessarily allow reach or visibility of the other layers of the network. We also need to harden some of our host devices. And generally, again, this is goes back to that goal of reducing the attack surface of the operating system of that host device. And there's all kinds of things we can do. Certainly, changing default passwords is the first one that usually comes to mind. You think, well, gosh, everybody does that already. Unfortunately, they don't. This is one of the, still today, one of the largest, I guess, ways to penetrate networks or IT infrastructures is default passwords in host devices. Maybe some obscure host device that no one's thought about or even knows it's there at times, but that still is a very effective way. But we do other things. We removed applications or services that's not being used, getting rid of old accounts and so forth and so on. Excuse me for the disruption. We also want to look at our operating systems. And in general, I think in most IT environments today, you're likely going to have some Windows operating systems and you're going to have some Linux-based systems. So there's specific tasks to do. Probably the real biggie, particularly in Windows, we want to separate the user and the administrative accounts. This is a big area. We want to get rid of guest accounts. Again, we want to use strong passwords and so forth. And once again, keep things, if we don't need applications, get rid of them. If we don't need services, get rid of them. Just because they were installed by default does not mean that we need those. And we, particularly in the Windows environment, in a larger environment where we might be using a domain controller to administer multiple, let's say, workstations, particularly desktop workstations, we want to use that domain controller with caution. There's an tendency, I think, to utilize that feature to administer a whole bunch of individual host devices. But having all of those host devices kind of goes back to that concept of that flat network. They all are potentially can have, particularly an event such as ransomware, spread to everywhere within that domain. So once again, you want to break up things in subdomains in a similar concept as we would break up a network into the layers or the segments and so forth. Linux, of course, again, popular operating system. I won't spend our time here to read through all of these, but again, these are certainly some of the specifics to do that are generally focused around, again, disabling or removing any unused services and things that you don't have. Again, use strong passwords, change all of those defaults and so forth. we could probably spend the rest of the day having a debate on Linux versus Windows. I think it's important to really just put that into perspective and keep in mind that Windows and Linux, granted, are both operating systems, but they're two pretty different operating systems. It's not necessary, in my opinion, a matter of one's better or one is worse, but it's just a recognition that they are different. Windows is really more of a closed system. It has limited configurability to it. In other words, it has configurability capability that Microsoft has given us. Whereas Linux, because it is a open source system, has virtually unlimited configurability to it. One thing that also I think you accept is there is no such thing as an operating system that is totally secure. Any of them can be compromised, but in general, again, keep in mind, they're simply different. They're designed different. And certainly on its surface out of the box, I think most computer geeks will at least agree that Linux is more secure simply because of the design of that operating system. But at the same time, Windows 10 can be secured, assuming that the right products are installed, particularly such as some antivirus software, whether it's a Microsoft product or an external manufactured supplied product. The key thing in here, it needs to be a filter or a filter based antivirus that uses signatures. And of course, because of that, signatures change over time. There's got to be a way to update those signature files and so forth. One of the big challenges I think we have today is what is often described as the Internet of Things family of devices, which can be a whole range of things. Some of the common ones that you might have in your facility are security cameras, maybe even a thermostat, card access systems, and that list goes on and on of particular devices. These are particularly problematic simply because often these devices are low cost and they're missing a lot of things that we sort of expect in a host device. And all of these missing features, particularly in the area of security, makes them somewhat vulnerable. And as example, let's take a typical security camera that you really have very little, if any, control over, to do things like disable services and that sort of thing, or even have the capability to implement some type of secure access to that device. So what do you do about these things? Well, the first thing is you want to isolate those devices. Once again, going back to our segmented or layered network, we simply want to put these devices on their own network. And then we want to implement some strong external packet filtering. Again, that packet filtering would be achieved through an access control list or a firewall, again, to protect these devices from the outside world, and maybe a little bit of praying as well that comes into play as a practical way, and hope for the best. But the key thing is get these devices out of our mainstream network infrastructure and put them in an environment where if they are breached, we minimize the impact of that event. Let's go back and look at the CIA Triad once again, but look at it from a different standpoint. Let's look at that from the viewpoint of a hacker that may be out to do harm. And of course, we'll talk about hackers in just a moment, but the CIA triad also becomes, this is the attack surface that a hacker might look for. In other words, they want to impact the confidentiality. So how do you do that? Well, you might breach an organization's data and expose some type of sensitive information. Maybe that's decoding encryption. Integrity, you might impact, let's say, manipulation of maybe stored data in your network infrastructure. Maybe it is data or information that is traversing your network. In other words, we want to disrupt our normal broadcast programming with our own programming, so to speak. And then finally, there's availability. We want to impact the availability of those network resources to the legitimate users. And we'll do that through maybe a denial of service attack, maybe a distributed denial of service attack, or we'll implement ransomware. In other words, we'll hold the infrastructure of that entity in ransom and so forth. So let's look at briefly look at the hacker. And we really have three types of hackers. Two are most prominent. We have the white hat hacker, and that is one that the intent is to protect an IT system. In other words, we're not out to do harm. We're out to find security holes, so to speak. Certainly, we have the black hat hacker, and this is the hacker that is out to do harm in some form or way. We also have this third one, the gray hat hacker, and they're out not to necessarily do harm. They're certainly not out to identify security holes to protection. They're simply in it for the challenge. In other words, you've put a lock on your door. Let me show you I can pick that lock. Not going to do anything once I get the door open. It's just that challenge and so forth. And of course, when we see in the media that hacker portrayed, that's always the black hat hacker. And for some reason, it's always a guy wearing a hoodie in a dark room surrounded by green screen terminals and so forth. That, yeah, makes a pretty good, I guess, portrayal, but that's not necessarily what you're really protecting against. This is more what the environment is. It's a data center environment. It's computers executing scripts and applications attempting to do harm to your infrastructure. So with that, one of the very, I think, important aspects of implementing security measures of any sort is to do penetration testing. This is also referred to as white hat hacking. In other words, how do I ensure that the practices and measures I put into place really work? Well, I'm going to do penetration testing. And I look at this is sort of the proof of performance of of cyber protection for IT systems. Again, a penetration test can be very focused on an individual area. It might encompass, let's say, a wide spectrum of areas. And again, the guy's goal is not to do harm. The goal is to find security flaws or holes and proactively fix those before, let's say, that black hat hacker comes along. Again, a fairly involved process, a little extra reading from that URL. Well, how do we do penetration testing? Well, we start with, we need some tools. And fortunately or unfortunately, there's a lot of hacking tools out on the available to us. And this is quite honestly, a short list. Maybe the 10 most popular tools that are out there to do some type of hacking or cybersecurity events. So what can you learn using these tools? Well, again, remember the attack chain. We need to find a host device, okay? Well, I've found one by some method using some of these hacking tools. I have no idea what that device is, but I've discovered an IP address that is valid. From that, I can obtain what type of operating system does that host device have. I can ascertain the active ports, which generally are going to be associated with a specific service that is being executed on that host device. I can identify those, even to the point of what versions of those. And with that information, are there vulnerabilities? And from that, I might have some insight to what that host device is, okay? And what is the default login information? And lo and behold, I have found a host device that has potential because of vulnerabilities that may exist to do some type of harm. Now, maybe I don't do harm to that host device. I might use this host device as a launching platform to reach many other host devices in a network. So this goes back to that segmented network. I want to minimize that reach or that impact if one individual host is breached. Ransomware, of course, again, is today is probably one of our biggest threats that is faced out there. And simply, it is a form of malware that infects and encrypts files. From that, a ransom is demanded, or money, to de-encrypt those files. And those ransomware can be delivered in several ways. One type is with the users through some type of phishing arrangement. In other words, to get a user to click on a particular URL or a file. There's also what is referred to as drive-by downloads, where you go to a maybe a website that has been impacted, and you automatically get a downloaded file that is executed whether you want it or not, so forth. So there's many ways. And of course, now your network has been encrypted and locked. And of course, the ransomware seeks money to retrieve that. Well, how do you combat against that? Well, one is you want to protect your data by backing it up. But backing up data sounds simple. Backing up data can be very complex. How do you back it up? You want to store that data externally somewhere. Often, if you look at backup scenarios, sequential backups are done, where each day I'm going to do a backup, but I'm going to do a sequential backup. I'm only going to back up what changed today. That sounds great in terms of conserving storage space, but in terms of restoring that can be a very long, grueling process and so forth. You also, again, want to be sure you can restore backed up data. And this is one of the common problems. Yes, I'm doing backups, but when it comes to the day I have to restore it, I discover all kinds of problems. Well, how do you prevent ransomware? Certainly you want to keep all your signature files updated. You want to use caution in opening URLs, particularly email attachments that you really don't know or trust the source. You want to, again, keep that updated signature-based antivirus software current. And again, educate users. educate users on the risk associated with unknown sources. And how do you respond to it? Well, you want to isolate the system or systems that are impacted, turn them off, disconnect the network. Be sure those secure backups are offline. And of course, we have a new area that has come into play is Cybercrime-as-a-Service, which is playing on the service architecture associated with cloud services. So we maybe do not necessarily have the skill and the capability to implement some type of cyber attack, but we can just go hire it out. And this literally are a couple of menus or pricing of services that are available. I know you probably can't read that on your screen, and I don't necessarily want you to read it because you might think I'm advertising cybercrime. But here's the URL where you can look at several of the services that are available for things that can be bought, particularly off of the dark web. So as to wrap up for today, this is my list of do these 10 things. And I can't overemphasize enough this change default logins because this continues to be a problem. Of course, use those strong passwords. Use fair paraphrases as the common ways to do that. This is the list of the 10 most common passwords. If you look at this list over probably the past 5 years, it's all the same 10 passwords. They just move sort of in position of the most popular. So again, those paraphrases can become very important. And of course, there's tools. One of the tools listed on our hacker tools is basically password cracking through dictionary list. In other words, lists that you can either obtain through open source software or even purchase. They are passwords list of basically entities that have been packed. So again, separate those administrative users accounts and Windows, segment the network. Of course, use packet filtering to control host access. We want to disable unused services. And a real biggie here, monitor your network. In other words, know what is normal. Know when something has changed. If there's not a real business reason for that change, there very well could be a cyber security event that has happened within your infrastructure. And again, in your backing up, use what I'll call is an intelligent host solution. Do complete backups. Yes, store those externally, but let that backup system attach to the network, back up what it needs to, and then disconnect itself. You know, in other words, not have this online backup system. And a really important one is don't be a social engineering victim. There is of course, balance between security and usability. Use this risk-based approach. The ultimate network security is the air gap. And on a serious side, this may not be practical in every case, but question, does a critical device absolutely need network access, particularly access on a public network? And then finally, again, a little bit of social engineering. This is very popular, it's very effective, and it continues to be used. Simply social engineering seeks to exploit a human weaknesses of we want to be helpful to people. In other words, we want to, again, provide information, try to be helpful. And with that are all of the various techniques that come from social engineering and the terms that are associated with that. But again, the key is user education to be able to recognize this phishing attempt or so forth. Even to the point of having test attacks. Part of a overall security audit is also attempting social engineering against your organization and so forth. So with that, I think it wraps it up for me. I would like to call, of course, attention. Larry has mentioned their 2021 annual conference coming up here in a few weeks. And if you are able to attend, you also can look forward to a continuing cybersecurity presentation. I'll say similar to this one, certainly not identical, where we will go into actually a little more in-depth, particularly in-depth of how ransomware really works and so forth. So Larry and John, I believe that's it for me.
All right, we did have one question, Wayne, from somebody
Okay.
said, if my personal PC is on the same router as my broadcast network, does it present a security threat even though its IP is on a different subnet?
Well, if that is, again, on the surface, I think you're describing a segmented network where you have one subnet. Of course, a subnet is a individual network that you have a group of devices. This personal PC is on another subnet. Unless there's some type of routing to connect those two subnets, then no, they're completely separate. However, if from that personal PC you can reach devices on that other subnet, then that routing is there. So maybe you want to use some type of filtering to limit what that access is, for instance.
I thought about when you were going through your presentation, the old movie called War Games. I don't know if you ever saw that or not, where the kid broke into the Defense Department computer.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And he did that by some sort of phishing, as you were talking about, where back in the old days where you had access to computers through dial-up networks. And he had
Exactly.
some sort of a program that just dialed all the numbers in this particular area. And he didn't know what he got into, but it happened to be one of the Defense Network's computers. So that sort of brought to mind when you were talking about hacking.
In fact, if we look at some of those hacking tools, one of the first things, again, if you're going to do some type of harm, you need to find a target. Well, how do you find a target? Well, you use one of those tools that basically goes out and effectively scans, in case, let's say, the public internet, looking for potential host devices. And once I find an active host device, then I can further explore. In fact, I'll show you some examples of some of the information you can gain from that in the presentation coming up at the conference. And it is amazingly what can be learned about this mystery IP that you may find, or this host device that you can discover from those tools. And again, you're not really, although there could be this individual sitting in the dark room exploring the networks, that's really not what you're combating against. It's really more of a data center environment where you have these scripted tools that are automating the process, and they're scanning hundreds of thousands of host devices in an hour.
Yeah, here's another question just popped up. What's your view on having a service monitor your network versus having it done in-house?
That is one of those, I think you have to make your own evaluation. Certainly they are commercial tools, often through commercial service offerings that do network security monitoring, okay? Certainly you can do a lot of that yourself using traditionally open source tools. So it's hard to say which is best, but I'm going to assume for most as broadcast engineers, you have enough to do already. And any of these type of tools you can use to offload some of that resources, I think are generally good. So having that network security monitoring from a number of commercial providers is probably the best way to go, unless you're very adept at system administration, particularly in the Linux environment, and have the capability or the time to keep up with that ongoing maintenance. Because remember, cybersecurity is a circular process. It's not something we go in and implement today. Yes, I may install a new firewall appliance today, but I have to ensure that device is updated on a regular basis. I have to monitor it to see what activity is going on and so forth.
John, you have any questions for Wayne?
No, I don't think I do. I always enjoy his presentations and walk away feeling overwhelmed. So that's a good thing. Thank you so much, Wayne, because you always do a great job. And I know the rest of us, including myself, always learn something from each one of your presentations.
Okay, Wayne, we sure appreciate that. And this webinar today has been recorded, and it will be placed later today. It will be up on our YouTube site. You can just simply go to YouTube and search for ABA Engineering Academy, all one word, and you'll see all this video plus all the ones that we've done since we've been presenting these monthly webinars. Now, our next webinar will actually be on August the 20th, and it's always on the third Tuesday of the month. And Mike Patton will actually be our special guest, and he will be talking about directional AM antenna systems and the MOM system. Mike is very well versed in designing and maintaining these type of systems. So make a note in your calendar for August the 20th for that will be our August webinar. We also want to remind you that the ABA, the Alabama Broadcast Association, will actually hold their annual convention August 13th and 14th, and the Engineering Academy will actually be hosting a engineering seminar on the 13th. That's Friday the 13th. I hope that's not a bad omen, but we will have several presentations. As a matter of fact, Wayne will be with us in person at that particular seminar, and we'll cover more in depth of what he did today. We also have Kirk Harnack will be talking about troubleshooting IP issues in your facility. Our friend Jeff Weldon will either be with us in person. Hopefully he'll be able to make it, because I saw today where they've opened up the Canadian border, so maybe he'll be able to cross the border and come down. If not, we'll have him on Zoom. And then John and I will actually be doing a presentation on the Alternative Broadcast Inspection Program. And we also just added another one. Mark Johnson with Link Up Satellite will be with us to give us an update on the repack and the filter installation that's going on throughout the country. So thank everybody for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again at our August 20th engineering webinar. Thank you so much.